Welcome everyone. Hope you all had a restful Thanksgiving week. Today's webinar topic is modernizing vendor intake and procurement workflows. This is a topic that our customers and prospects have a lot of interest in, and we said we'll have a webinar and bring in the right SMEs for the conversation. Today we have Elizabeth Moran, Workday financial expert from Operative, and Girish Reddy from Onward will share their insights, perspectives, best practices, and a solution for particularly vendor onboarding and managing it in an easy to use application. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphone so that we can avoid any static and background noise. This webinar is being recorded. We will share this webinar with all the folks who have registered and folks who have not been able to make it for the webinar. In terms of if you have any questions, please put it in the chat window. We will cover it as part of our presentation and as well as during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, to set the context, workflow automation has been in the top of mind for enterprises. Obviously, AI is the holy grail, and the intent of AI is the automation and enabling workflows to utilize the best of the processes within an enterprise. Particularly for procurement workflows, what are the challenges involved? What do we mean by vendor supplier onboarding? What are some of the considerations and solutions that are available and how to get started? With that, I would like to invite Elizabeth Moran to share her perspective on vendor onboarding, and give us the low-level details of the challenges, the enterprise that we face, and how to get started.
Great, thank you, Prabhu. So before I get started, my background is in the procure-to-pay space. I have almost 25 years experience in deploying ERP systems, predominantly PeopleSoft and Workday in the supply chain area, and with a heavy focus on procure-to-pay. So I've seen many customers struggle in the area of vendor onboarding or supplier onboarding. And these customers are in a variety of industries. So I've worked with customers in healthcare, financial services, banking, retail, entertainment. And the one thing that they all have in common is how do we get our vendors to onboard in a seamless way? How do we make it easy for our suppliers to integrate with our systems? How do we collect the information, and how do we make it easy not only for them but for our AP and our procurement teams? And I think there hasn't been one single system that's been able to solve this problem. So in today's session, we're going to talk about, well, what is really vendor onboarding and why is it important? Why are we focusing on it? And what would be the ideal solution? If we could start from scratch, what would we put into a solution to solve the issues with vendor onboarding? So I'm going to start with what? What is vendor onboarding? So vendor onboarding is the process to invite, vet, and I think, Prabhu, if we could move to the next slide. Vendor onboarding, thank you, is the process to invite, vet, and engage with your suppliers for the purposes of procuring goods and services. And it's often a multi-step process involving many individuals and many departments within your organization. The thing that makes it complicated is the initiation of that process often starts with individuals and departments who aren't in the procurement team. They don't have an overview of the policies of procurement. They initiate the process with the supplier, and then at some point they involve procurement. When procurement steps in, they need to involve other departments. They may involve legal, they may involve IT. Depending on the access that the supplier needs, they may involve security. And so many teams and many groups are involved in the procurement, in the onboarding of a supplier, which not only makes it difficult for the organization, but can make it difficult for the supplier themselves. And why is it important to streamline that process? Why is it important to make it easy to onboard a supplier? Well, you don't want to frustrate the supplier. The supplier relationship is very important. So if you look at every part of your business, whether you procure goods or services, you need your suppliers. Very similar. They need you as a customer. You also need them as a supplier. And so it's important to keep that relationship. It's also very important to vet your suppliers. You are making payments to these organizations. You want to make sure that you're making payments to the correct bank account. You want to make sure that you're not sending payments incorrectly. And so it's important that the data that you're collecting is valid and it's correct. The other thing that you want to make sure of is compliance with regulations. And I'm thinking here about 1099 data for those smaller suppliers. So you want to make sure that the information that you're collecting from the suppliers is accurate for reporting. And how do you make sure that the information is correct? You want to make sure that that information you're collecting is straight from the supplier. You don't want to get that information secondhand from people that are keying it in from your organization. Ideally, you want to collect that information directly from the supplier. And so I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So what are some of the challenges with vendor onboarding? I mentioned some of them in that there are many people or many departments involved in the vendor onboarding process. There's also, with the current systems, there's a lot of rigidity, and I found it's very hard for customers to be able to set up the routings and the approvals the way they want it. So, for example, the way that you want to onboard office supplier is going to be very different than the way that you onboard a supplier for your facilities, the way that you onboard a professional services supplier. And so the rules around the approvals and the routings for the different types of supplies is going to be different. So having a system to be able to change the rules depending on the type of supplier is going to be very important. So having that flexibility is going to be very important in the system. And the systems that I've worked with, I found to be extremely rigid. The other thing that's very important is to have that seamless data integration. So when a supplier enters their data into a system, having that integrate directly into your ERP system. So not having somebody take that information and having to rekey it. We all know if you have AP and rekey data into your ERP system, no, undoubtedly, it's going to be incorrect or there's going to be data keying issues. And when it comes to things like names or addresses or bank information, it's very important to get that information correct. And therefore, it's important to take that information directly from the supplier. The other thing that's very important with the onboarding information that you collect from the supplier is to make it easy for the supplier to enter that information. So the systems that I've worked with in the past, I've found that there's endless amount of questions that the supplier needs to complete. The one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to make that difficult for the supplier. You don't want to make the onboarding process difficult for the supplier, because the next thing you'll know is that they're going to mail you a Word document with all the information that you need. And that's the last thing that you want. So the idea is to make the form extremely simple, so it takes them no time to complete it, and you've collected all the information that you need. The other thing to consider is the type of suppliers that you're onboarding. So not everybody is savvy with the computer. You might have suppliers that are mum and pop shops that may not be savvy about completing forms. So you need to have the UI very simple, so it encourages them to complete the onboarding process. So that's some of the challenges with the current systems that are out there with the onboarding process. So I've touched on some of the things that we can do to overcome this. I've touched on some of the things that we can overcome with these challenges, but I'll go over a few more of them. If we could move on to the next slide, Prabhu. So I think if we could move on to the next one. So some of the things I've talked about, intuitive UI, going back to those smaller suppliers, those mum and pop shops who may not interact or often interact with systems, making the UI very simple, very intuitive. We don't want to overcomplicate it. Even for those suppliers who are using web pages on a more frequent basis, we don't want to make the form have a lot of questions in it. We want to keep it simple. The other thing that we want to make easy is there are going to be various users within the supplier that are going to interact with the system. So again, you don't know the capabilities of those individuals. So again, make the UI very easy. We want to have a seamless integration with the ERP system. We want to have validations upfront. We don't want the data to come into the ERP system and validate it at that point. We want to catch those errors up front. We want to inform the user up front that there's something wrong with the data. We want the user to correct the data up front, not by the time it gets into the ERP system. We want to have flexible rules. So the rules, depending on the type of supplier, we want to be able to route that the information to the correct person within the organization, dependent on the type of supplier. So for example, if a supplier needs access to your data, that supplier is going to need approval from your IT department, from your security department, very different than a supplier that's taking care of your landscaping, supplier that's going to provide you office supplies. Their routing is going to be different. So we need to build in that type of flexibility. And also, we want to be able to catch duplicate suppliers up front. We don't want suppliers to go through this rigmarole only to find out later that we already have that supplier in our ERP system. So let's try and catch that supplier up front. When the requester comes in to request a supplier, let's stop them at that point. So we're not going through the whole onboarding process only to find out later that we've already got that supplier in our system. So these are some of the things that we could consider if we were to start a new onboarding process right from scratch. So one of the things that I didn't cover off when I was talking about what onboarding does entail is, yes, onboarding is vetting your supplier. It's getting your supplier into the system. But what happens after you get your supplier into the system? What can the supplier do? Well, it would be great if the supplier would be able to see their purchase orders. It would be great if the supplier would be able to see their invoices, see their payments. They wouldn't have to call accounts payable asking, where is my payment? Why is my payment delayed? They would be able to see that their invoice is in match exception, that they charged more than that was negotiated on a PO, that their goods weren't received, that there was a delay in shipment, and so that's why their invoice hasn't been paid. Or they could see that the payment was made and it's sitting with the banks, hasn't hit their bank account yet. So that would be great for that type of information to be presented to the supplier, preventing AP from picking up those types of phone calls or answering those types of emails. So that's, even though that's not directly related to vendor onboarding, if a system could consider those types of integrations or interfaces, that would be ideal. So, thanks, Prabhu.
Excellent. Excellent, Liz. Couple of questions, right? In a given enterprise, things are always in a transition, right? So I want to give two scenarios and, love to get your perspective. One scenario is, let's say a customer is in the middle of an M&A, right? And most likely there may be duplicates in vendors, like, you may be transacting with vendors from the two different organizations. How do you go about in that scenario? Like, how would you come up with the standardization? How would you look at vendor onboarding in that type of an environment?
So how would you onboard vendors from the two organizations
Correct.
into one system?
Correct.
So yeah, you would analyze the data. Hopefully the data is clean in both systems. Oftentimes, more than not, it's somebody's got clean data, somebody's got stale data. So you would analyze the data, obviously get the clean data. You would inactivate the stale data and onboard the most recent, the most active data. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Correct, correct. Because that's a scenario from one of our customers. Similarly, on a where when a customer is moving from one application to the other. I know you mentioned you have worked in PeopleSoft, you have worked in Workday. When customer is in the middle of a transition, like moving from one application to the other, what are some of the considerations or best practices or even things to watch out for from your perspective?
So I think the biggest thing is analyzing your suppliers and making sure that you don't carry everyone over, doing an analysis and deciding that are you going to look at your suppliers and say, okay, anybody that I haven't had any transactions with in the last I'm only bringing people over that I've had transactions with in the last 12 months or in the last 18 months. And if I hadn't had a transaction with them beyond that time, I'm not going to carry them forward. And then even if I pick a time frame, let's say 12 months, I'm going to look at my list of suppliers in that 12 months. And I would guarantee that you have duplicate suppliers in your legacy system. Then do some analysis and identify those duplicate suppliers and only bring over one set of those suppliers, and then do a cleanup of your data so that when you start your new system, you've only got one version of active suppliers.
Got it. Got it. That makes sense. Thank you, Liz. Now I would like to invite Girish to give a demo of the application so that you can see how the overview and the challenges and the design patterns that Liz highlighted, you can see it in action. Over to you, Girish.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. You can see on-ramp, right, Prabhu?
Yes, Girish.
Awesome. Great. All right. Thank you, Liz. That was a very good overview of the procurement workflows in general, but obviously focusing on vendor onboarding, the challenges and the kind of challenges that large customers run into, as well as what happens after onboarding. How do you manage the vendors and make sure that they have the right tools so that they can self-service themselves? So that was a very good end-to-end overview. And in this part of the webinar, I'm going to walk you through the demo of our application that helps with some of these challenges. So what I'm showing here is our application called OnRamp. OnRamp is a Atlassian Jira service management application. So it sits on top of Jira and JSM. Uh, Customers can install it through the standard Atlassian marketplace. And once they install, they can access the app through the apps menu. I'll give you a quick view into the application and then go into the business flow as far as what the vendor might see or the procurement manager might see, etc., before coming back to the app to see how things tie together. In OnRamp, we have the concept of flows, which is a sequence of steps that forms a business process. So for example, here we have created a couple of procurement related flows. One is vendor onboarding, another one is intake to procure. And similarly, there are a bunch of other flows as well that one can create. Let's take a look at the vendor onboarding flow. So the idea here is we have a triggering point for this particular flow. You can select from any number of triggers. So we have integrations to more than 50 enterprise systems, both HR and financials. So for example, you could connect to Workday, SAP, etc. Or your triggering point could be a form. In this particular case, given its vendor onboarding, I'm going to demo a life cycle where a vendor is submitting a form in order to trigger their onboarding for the particular customer. So as Liz talked about the form, how simple it can be in order to make it as frictionless as possible for the vendor. And once the vendor submits that form, what are the actions that need to be taken in order for that vendor to be activated? That's the flow that we'll walk you through. So you select Jira or request type in the trigger, and you can then select any number of tasks from our task library. So we provide a bunch of tasks. Some of them are automated. For example, if you need to create an email account for the vendor, we can automatically set that up by connecting to your Azure AD, Google Workspace, Okta, or any other identity management system. We support a bunch of them as well. You could set up tasks such as procurement review, where your procurement manager might want to take a look at this particular vendor's background, perhaps look at their TPRM reports, which is the third-party risk management. Our application provides integrations into the popular TPRM systems as well, so that you can have quick access to the risk profile of this particular vendor. So that kind of a task where you are reviewing the risk could be manual. But once that review is done and let's say the procurement manager approves it, you can then use our application to create the vendor automatically in a bunch of systems. So for instance, here, just as an example, we are creating the supplier in Salesforce, Coupa, and Workday. Again, in your organization, if you're using any of these systems, rather than doing a double entry in all of these systems, you can use the application to automatically create them. You can then set up the portal access for the supplier. We are going to revisit this because this is where once portal access is given to the supplier, they will be enabled with self-service. So one of the things that Liz discussed is around the ability for a vendor to look at their own POs, invoices, being able to update their information, whether it's bank account information or adding additional contacts. All of those tasks can be completed in the JSM portal. So we'll walk you through that. And similarly, you can set up a bunch of other tasks as part of OnRamp. And once you configure this here, whenever a new form by a vendor is submitted, we are able to review it, create the necessary subtasks, as well as automatically completing some of the tasks as well. So now if I go to the portal, so here is a portal that we set up for this demo. And in this portal, it's an external facing portal for all vendors. And here we have enabled a few different forms. For example, vendor survey or vendor security assessment, onboarding a new vendor, which is what we are going to walk through, as well as a few other actions that vendors can take. So these are all, for example, vendor security assessment. We provide these forms as part of the JSM portal so that you can now send a vendor, let's say every 6 months or every year, a questionnaire, a security questionnaire that allows them to complete it and then allows you to then look at and ensure that the vendor is following the right security protocols. So here we have a standard questionnaire that customers can send to the vendors. Let's take a look at onboarding a new vendor. So again, this is a form that is completely configurable and can be set up in the right amount of detail that allows you to onboard the vendor. So let's say this form is sent to the vendor and they start entering their information. I'm just going to select a few fields here. You could make the form interactive. So for example, if you select US or based on the country, the relevant fields get visible. So for US, obviously you will need a TIN, so that's enabled. You can set up contact details. Some of these fields also have validations, whether within the form or it can also connect to external systems to validate it. Banking details also can be securely retrieved from the form. And once the form is submitted, the rest of the process, I'll show you what that looks like. We also have the ability to validate some of the forms, the banking details that the vendor might submit. For example, if you have US and you ask for a routing number, then the ability to verify if the routing number is correct or not, some of those validations we are able to perform. I'm just going to leave that information for now and then submit it. So now, once the vendor has submitted the form, you can start reviewing it and make sure that everything looks good. As a procurement manager now, I'm going to review the form. And this is the view that as a procurement manager, I can see what exactly the form that was submitted by the vendor. Make sure everything looks good. If there are any specific details that are missing, they can connect to the vendor through the same ticket. So when they respond here, the vendor will be able to look at it and they can also update the ticket. This is the way in which a simple form can be submitted. Most of what you have seen here is part of the JSM portal functionality. The forms, you can obviously customize it to meet your needs. And once the procurement manager has reviewed the details and they feel like they have enough information, they can go here and start the onboarding of the vendor by clicking on Start Onboarding. This is where our application on-ramp comes into picture. So what is happening behind the scenes for those of you who are familiar with Jira and JSM is that we are calling our applications post function as part of this workflow. So when you have your workflow set up to start onboarding, we are calling the on-ramp workflow and creating the tasks that were previously defined. Let me show you one of the previously created tasks. So this is another vendor that we onboarded, let's say last week. Here you'll see that the form details are available, and these are the form details that the vendor submitted. And then you can see the list of all the individual tasks that were previously defined in OnRamp. So this is the exact list of tasks that we see here. And we are able to take what was defined in this flow and created the list of tasks as per that definition. And as I was saying earlier, you could make some of these manual if it is create supplier in Salesforce where it can be completely automated. And these kind of actions can be taken by our application, and making the dual entry for multiple systems redundant. That's no longer needed. Our application also connects to DocuSign and other e-sign applications. If you want to send a final contract for signatures to the vendor, you will be able to do that as well. You can also schedule time for feedback, whether it is quarterly or annually. So these are tasks that can be set up at the initial stages as part of onboarding, and our app is going to create the relevant tasks at the right time so that users know whom to reach out for feedback, etc. The same concept can be used for security questionnaires as well. We have some customers who said they like to send security questionnaires once in 6 months, for example. In that case, you can schedule those kind of security questionnaires to be sent automatically through our app. So that's an overview of how users can define what are the steps that are part of a vendor onboarding. And then they can set up the various forms as part of the vendor management portal. Any number of forms. We provide out-of-the-box forms, but these can be completely configurable. And finally, once the form is submitted, you can take the relevant action. Based on the type of form, you can take an action, whether it is creation of additional tasks or automatically completing some of them. And finally, as a vendor, we talked briefly about how a vendor can do self-service. How can they get questions answered without being a burden on the procurement team? As a vendor, when I log into the portal, I'll be able to access OnRamp through the menu. And here, they'll be able to get some basic information about their payments and invoices. So here you can see that for this particular vendor, it shows who are the contacts. It shows the list of purchase orders that are assigned to them, as well as their payment status for the various invoices. This is something that in this particular demo, we are pulling from Workday, where Workday is the backend financial system. And this allows the vendor to get some information about their POs, invoices, payments, and hopefully that addresses some of their questions. If not, they obviously have the ability to submit a question here, or they can also leverage an AI agent to get some of their questions answered. That's probably the AI agent part we'll cover in a future webinar. But this is something that most vendors have questions about. Common questions can be automated, or it can be provided in a self-service manner, especially customers who have hundreds of vendors, this kind of a self-service option reduces the burden on the procurement team. That's an overview of what we wanted to show as far as the app and the functionality for vendor onboarding and ongoing vendor management.
Excellent.
Back to you, Prabhu.
Thanks, Girish. Any questions, Tammy, Raju? Is this connecting with your, processes, workflows? Any initial feedback?
I think this is a great solution. From my perspective at CompTIA, I kind of need to flip it on its head. We're a supplier, and being asked by especially distributors and resellers throughout in every single state and counties and cities and states of completing and tracking and managing all of those vendor requests that we get. So I think that there may be some ways we could leverage this, but like in a reverse, instead of being the using this for customers and onboarding vendors that for goods and services, it's kind of, we're needing it sort of to reverse engineer it. Does that make sense? So I just need to think through how that is, but definitely something like this of managing all of those different relationships, I think would be really, really helpful. But yeah, this has been really interesting to see what Onward is doing.
How do you manage today, like the list of suppliers? Like you manage it in the ERP system itself, external spreadsheets?
Honestly, I think right now it's in Excel spreadsheets. And yeah, we don't have right now a system in place for managing all of those, and we're in the process of trying to get onboarded, especially with a variety of different distributors and resellers in every single state. So as we scale that system, we definitely need some sort of workflow and automated process to manage those. And with each one of those different, contracts and contract vehicles, there's different requirements and reporting requirements that will be needed. So I'm just trying to figure out how we do that and scale it so we can scale very easily.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, from my side, I happen to see what happens behind. We are the service suppliers. We happen to fill dozens of these supplier forms, even big tycoon companies, not the smaller ones. Some have their web pages are like not relevant. Like when your company is a 5 years old baby, they're asking for the financial data for last 10 years. It's irrelevant. I mean, that shows that systems are not updated and not taking the data correctly. And also, when after filling, you don't see the workflow, what is happening. It's like a black hole. You don't know how many we keep filling, and then what is good one to pick or not to pick. Mostly you follow up to the procurement team. It's good to see systems like this automated, and then where you can see where it is stop and then whom to follow up with if there is a room. And I'm very happy to see Onward systems and what you are trying to build. Thanks for arranging this.
Got it. Right. I think most of the focus is on the customer side, but the supplier who is filling out the form, what sort of visibility, what sort of clarity, what sort of validation we could provide so that the supplier is well informed on the process from start to finish. That's a good point.
Well, and if there's an AI capability to because a lot of those forms have all the same information. So, and if there was a way to, upload the vendor form and fill out the information, at least do the first pass, and then and complete it from end to end, especially like with the DocuSigns, there's a lot of like legal signatures that have, so if it can be done in the reverse, that could be very useful from my perspective.
Got it. Any commentary there, Liz? Have you seen any solutions that caught your attention for these use cases?
I think, the ability to be able to share the data. So, if you could fill out the form once and then agree to share it, that would be great.
Got it.
Or even if the supplier could fill out the form once and save it off on their system, save it off on their own. So you wouldn't need to, so Onward wouldn't need to save it, but if the supplier could save it and then upload it again. But the form's going to be slightly different, right, for each customer.
Right.
Exactly.
But the basic information, name, address, and bank is all, everybody's going to ask for that.
DUNS and FEIN, and I mean, there's probably a dozen or so things that are on all of these different vendor procurement documents that are all in there, and then
some extra certifications. Sometimes they will ask if you are a diversity supplier, what certifications you have it. Mostly the data is recycled, repetitive, as you said. Some forms they will ask in the first page, in the last page, self-certifications are like, any organization backing up, but the data is recyclable.
Got it. Interesting. Yep. We'll think through that in our solutions too. Awesome. All right. Thank you everyone for your time. Engaging conversation. We look forward to continuing this as a series. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Girish.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
thank you, everyone.